Welcome back. Today in this lecture, we're going to be talking about Africa to about the year 1800. Uh, this will include our kind of covering or reviewing what we talked about initially. I know it's been some time since we addressed the continent, so we're going to just quickly get us back up to date as far as what's happening, discuss the African diaspora, the continued developments surrounding that event that contributed to um, what contributed to it and what arose from this event, as far as the domestic or communal developments in the areas of society, economics, and politics with regard to the various regions of the African continent and the varied populations and their how they went about addressing and kind of defining different experiences for themselves. Socially, this is going to include a overview of the demographic impacts and also an impact on the social order itself within these various political entities, basically empires, small empires, or other city state like structures throughout the continent. Economically, we're going to talk about slave exportation, get a sense of the numbers, and also the phenomenal growth of the slave trade as we move forward into and through the industrial era, the 18th century, how this is going to impact and basically drive the slave trade. Within that context, we're going to see how difficult it was to maintain a sense of regulation of that institution, and also the social and political kinds of consequences that are going to arise as a result of it. There's also going to be, in an economic sense, a contraction of the domestic market within the African and continental economy itself, as the consumer base essentially shrinks with the mass exportation of humanity. Politically, there's going to be essentially a paradoxical kind of arrangement that crops up. You're going to have consolidation of political structures on one hand, and the organization of more definable kind of states. And along with that, we're going to see kind of the dissolution, the fracturing of states as a result of the slave trade itself. With regard to consolidation, we'll see demographically how many African uh, states are going to resort to things like polygamy and also kind of gravitate more towards a patriarchal type of society, male dominated. You'll also get a sense of the rise of Islamic influence, Christian influence as well, as, in addition to a militarization of these African states and their social structure. This was done for several reasons. First, there was a drive to either conquer and enslave, or be conquered and be enslaved. So there was this need, this kind of existential need to insulate oneself, to take up arms in order to protect oneself and one's society, to make sure that they were not conquered and enslaved. So, on the one hand, that's kind of you're coming together and creating kind of these hierarchical structures of political and social order. But at the same time, when you have that happen between a series of states in close proximity to one another, then this is going to contribute to instability, kind of prolonged periods of conflict and war, and also foment civil war within various communities existing under one kind of organized empire. So this is a period of severe challenges. It's highly contested time in African history, and we'll get a sense of that and how this played out across the continent. To begin with, however, let's take a look at the African diaspora. Again, this is defined as essentially a mass of forced exodus, in this case of African men and women from the continent to disparate parts of the world. What numbers are we talking about? Well, essentially, the volume of slave exports occurred or is estimated at, and it has to be stressed that these are estimates, that roughly 9.5 million slaves had been sent along the trans-Saharan and Red Sea routes, basically towards the east, over the course of about 11 centuries. And 9.5 million slaves have been exported to the Americas, North and South America, over about 4 centuries, and we've already addressed that in earlier lectures. That number jumps, however, to an approximately 12 million person mark when we factor in a mortality rate of about 25% for the slaves that were lost as a result of the what's known as the Middle Passage. This is basically embarking on ships, slave ships, enduring the horrid standard of living, if you can even call it that, these inhuman actually conditions on the slave ships, getting to the New World. That during that Middle Passage, many lives were estimated to have been lost. Now, the numbers of lives were not recorded. Any loss was recorded as weight and not as individuals. One of the best representations of this in kind of a visual sense is the movie Amistad, which is put out, I believe, is produced in the late 1990s, and it was basically with regard to an event in American U.S. history during the 1840s, in which this slave ship Amistad had come into American waters, and the issues that arose as a result of that. There was in the beginning of the film, there's a segment which deals or provides a very vivid, very graphic depiction of the Middle Passage. I recommend it. However, I would warn you that it's quite graphic, and again, it's quite disturbing. 70% of the slaves that were shipped from about the year 1700 to about 1850 to the Americas. This is when the most prolific slave trade was happening, in getting African slaves to the Americas. So roughly the shipment of slaves, again, was over the course of about a 4-century span, but it's this 150 years from 1700 to 1850 when the bulk of that shipment begins. Generally speaking, it's estimated again that about 60 to 70% of those entering the transatlantic slave trade were men. They were exporting millions of not only young productive men but also young women, so that there's this and because that's the greatest value attached to humanity. That basically, you want people that are going to be the strongest, be provide the greatest amount of labor. So that's going to affect a certain demographic as far as age cohort is concerned. As a result of this exodus that takes place, holes begin to appear in African society as far as just the loss that's becoming evident, and this is going to lead to increased practices, like I said, of polygyny, men marrying and taking on several women as wives, and also as a result of that, you're going to have more of a patriarchal, male-dominated society as well. With regard to kind of the European infiltration of Africa, during this time frame, uh, the European settlements are mostly going to be along the coastlines of the African continent. There would be more formalized kind of imperial imposition of authority, European authority in the deeper into the interiors of the African continent, but that really wouldn't take place until about the 1870s. That's largely as a result of advancements that were taking place in combating disease, things like malaria and yellow fever, to which Europeans were especially susceptible. This claimed many lives of Europeans in these tropical zones. Spanish and Portuguese slave traders in West Africa were joined also by the English, who began to first arrive and set up settlements in Africa as early as 1562 in what is today the Sierra Leone region. By about 1606, the Dutch and the Flemish followed. In 1626, the French established themselves at a place called Saint Louis, which was at the mouth of the Senegal River. In the 1650s, the Swedes and Danes also began to vie for establishing a presence in Africa. And by 1683, the Prussians, kind of the dominant Germanic state in Europe, also began to fortify a settlement of their own along the Gold Coast of Africa. So, we focused quite a bit of attention on the Portuguese and Spanish elements and kind of settlements, but by the close of the 17th century, here you're seeing, everybody, many European states trying to get in on this, on settling in Africa, opening up and profiting from slave trade. African kingdoms along this region, basically what is West Africa, began to consolidate power in order to meet the demand, the volume of slaves that increased. Essentially, the number of slaves began to increase as these small polities, small populations, social groups begin to fuse together into larger ones. Okay? This benefited the increasing demands of the slave trade. African centers of power also, as I mentioned from the top, grew increasingly militarized. They developed what were known as kind of warrior aristocracies, and can be seen roughly across much of the entire continent during this period of time. War was for goods, booty, essentially. This also helped to define differences between African populations, reinforcing ethnic identities. This propelled conflicts and contests between these various ethnic groups, and this helped to accentuate instability and fueled, as I mentioned, kind of this perpetual gravitation towards war and conflict. For example, and there are several examples we'll cover here, with the retreat of the Moorish influence in the 1590s, which I think I addressed in the one of the earlier lectures from the first module, there are going to be these series of successive conflicts between the smaller city-states that cropped up as a result of the absence of that kind of Moorish influence. And this led to the rise of several neighboring competing powers. By the 17th and 18th century, there's an expansion of the central Sudanese economy. Again, this is mainly as a result of slave labor, the slave trade, and we're talking about with slave labor being put to use in Africa itself in places or industries that include agriculture, transportation, trade, craft production, communication, as well as industries or fields that included the military and using slaves as soldiers, and also within the political bureaucracy, civil servants as well. By 1730, you have the rise of what's known as a Kano aristocracy. This is a formidable political order that had well established and disciplined military capabilities. They were able to consolidate control over the Hausa land region, which, again, to reference the African continent and orient yourself kind of visually, take a look at the your textbook map, the map located on page 454. The Kano aristocracy was a highly organized entity, had various offices for protocol, so that there were certain functions of the state that would be organized and carried out. There would be departments for internal and external affairs. There would be a kind of a hierarchy leading to regional and local government infrastructure, political infrastructure, and there would also be a treasury department to organize and run the financial matters of this state. Another example is the Sengu Bambara Kingdom. This is located in the Delta region of the middle Niger River. It rose to prominence roughly about the year 1710 with the ascent of the ruler Bitan Kulubali to authority. It's during this time that there's this imposition. Kulubali is going to reorganize the kingdom's social structure and use his slave army to dominate the region. Now, Kulubali dies in the 1750s, and as a result of that, there's going to be a period of civil war that erupts within the Sengu Bambara kingdom. However, this entity, this state or kingdom, did remain relevant until about 1860. So, and again, it shows you, it conveys the kind of this relationship, this kind of very tentative relationship between order and instability. And we'll see this kind of exhibited again and again. One of the better known empires to arise in roughly the same region, basically in eastern Nigeria, what is today eastern Nigeria, is the Benin Empire. This lasted from about the 15th to the 19th century. It was an early state created to, in one respect, provide slaves in significant supply to the Europeans. By the mid-17th century, the Wari, this group within the Benin state, was going to rise up and begin to challenge Benin authority because the Wari wanted to trade directly with the Europeans themselves. Again, a very common characteristic and kind of phenomenon that affected these social political structures in Africa. The slave trade expanded in this region in the 18th century, and Benin influence and power began to fluctuate during this period of time, again in the 18th and into the 19th century. And just to kind of carry this through, in 1897, I know this is getting a little ahead of ourselves, but by 1897, the English had penetrated into the interior, into the Benin Empire itself, and managed to seize control. And when that happened in 1897, they plundered the empire of several cultural treasures. Now, I mention this because there will be a scan of a one-page article in a periodical that I subscribe to, The Week, and it talks about the running contemporary debate here in the 21st century over the confiscation of cultural heritage and kind of treasures that were seized in this particular example by the English from this Benin, the Benin people, and how they're basically essentially now warehoused in museums, cultural centers around most of the Western world today, and the running debate now as to what should happen to those treasured artifacts. That in some cases they're being returned back to the original owners from which they were seized. I believe the Benin bronzes, as they were known, as they are known, have been returned, or there are negotiations to try and make sure that they are returned. But it is a good article. It's again pretty brief, so I encourage you to take a look at that, because here we see a direct correlation between what's happening during this period of time that we're studying and the effects that are still kind of being wrangled and kind of wrestled with in our own present day. Yet another kingdom or political, influentially political entity coming up here in the same region was the Fan Kingdom of the Dahomey. This was a neighboring power to Benin, and it was located essentially in the southern portion of what is today Benin, or what was the Benin Empire there. It thrived amidst the instability, the fluctuations that took place within the Benin Empire, and that were caused by the Atlantic slave trade as well. And the Dahomey became a major regional power by about 1700, the dawn of the 18th century. In 1720, King Agaja of the Dahomey began a campaign of conquest over smaller and older polities, kind of exploiting their weaknesses, and that through that campaign were able to kind of obviously establish their own influence in the area and expand it. A decade later, in 1730, the neighboring state of Oyo actually began to exact nominal tribute from the Dahomean people and Dahomean rulers, and others under Dahomean rule, the kind of non-Dahomean people that were under Dahomean influence, began to also take this as an opportunity to rise up in rebellion, which also helped drive, in many respects, the slave trade itself, as populations began to take control, war amongst each other with those that were taken captive. They would be shipped to the coast to begin that middle passage to the Americas. Another state in the Horn of Africa, so now we're turning attention to the eastern region of the African continent, and focusing on the Ethiopian Empire with its rich cultural and political identity. For the most part, one reason for this was because of its retention of its autonomy for much, if not all, of this period of time we're looking at. The Ethiopian emperor at the time, Circe Dingle, defeated Ottoman attempts to conquer Ethiopia. This is roughly about 1572 to 1575, and so they kept the Ottomans at bay, and also by 1640 they had managed to expel Portuguese traders and influence by that mid 17th century mark. As a result of these kinds of combination of factors, Ethiopia retained its identity in many respects. There were religious developments that they did have to grapple with, however. In one case, Emperor Susenyos in 1622 is going to side with a pro-Jesuit faction within his own court. He himself is going to, during that period of time, proclaim himself a Catholic, but his effort to kind of set a standard and an example for his people failed. Many Ethiopians throughout Ethiopian society remained members of the Ethiopian Church. And over the next 150 years, you're going to see that Ethiopia is going to maneuver between primarily Christian and Islamic influences in many respects. This is best seen during the Kara dynasty, which lasted from about 1640 up through 1874. This dynasty had Islamic leanings and was successful in opening pilgrimage routes to Mecca to fulfill their Islamic obligation of pilgrimage to the holiest city in the Islamic religion, and in doing so, by opening these routes and keeping them open, they managed to consolidate considerable control over the Darfur region of what is today part of Sudan. They also, the Ethiopian Empire also profited from lucrative trade routes in and around the Red Sea region and into the Indian Ocean. By 1667, or from 1667 to 1682, Emperor Johannes ensured acceptance of Orthodox Christians. So again, you see Ethiopia here kind of trying to balance a live and let live mentality, essentially, between various religious groups within Ethiopian control. Muslim merchants under Johannes's reign could also practice their faith, but they were required to live in separate communities in order to ensure kind of a sense of security and protection and peace, really, by and large. From 1700 to 1800, there's an acceleration of Islamization in the Darfur area. Again, Darfur today is in the western sections, southern and western sections of what is today Sudan, or South Sudan. But probably during this period of time that we're looking at today, it encompassed probably a larger area, because lines on maps were less distinct during this period of time, we'll say. With that push towards greater Islamization, Islamic scholars were invited and encouraged to settle in the Darfur region. And these religious issues, combined with changes in social power, began to actually erode in the imperial authority, the centralized authority of the Ethiopian state. Nobles in Ethiopia began to increase their power and with it autonomy. Along the Swahili coast, so now we're turning attention south of Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. We're going south along the eastern coastline of Africa. There were similar stresses that existed between Muslim merchants and Portuguese or Christian settlers. In West Central Africa, so now we're quickly pivoting to what is today Congo. You have the creation of the Congo Kingdom from about 1500, the year 1500 to 1700. This kingdom, the Congo Kingdom, was influenced by Portuguese arrivals. So it went essentially from being a matrilineally oriented society where local village life was autonomous and basically affairs of the local community were decided by the leading female members of the community. That was replaced by a more patriarchal based order and social order and political order. There was also the rapid expansion of the slave trade in this area as well. This again resulted in the militarization of Congolese authority. There were essentially two classes of slaves that began to define themselves here. Within the Congo Kingdom, you have those slaves that were exportable, and also a class of slaves that were deemed too vital to the Congolese social order, political order, and therefore could not be sold or shipped, overseas. Nonetheless, by about as early as 1612, around 10,000 slaves were being shipped annually from areas like Angola. This would be an annual sum, benchmarks that would last for up through the year 1700. When we get into the 18th century, so 1700 on, this number is going to spike to become a export of about 40,000 slaves per year. Part of this reason for this is because of the industrialization that's beginning to take place in Europe, which is going to increase the demand of raw materials needed to fuel the industrial engines of industry within the European marketplace. We'll talk about that when we talk about the Industrial Revolution of the mid to late 18th century, but this is one reason for spikes in these numbers of slaves being transported. In 1650, from about 1650 to about 1800, in regions that were just north of the Congolese kingdom, a place called Lugano, this became a key slave exporting region. And from about 1700 to 1800, in the area of Angola, which is just south of the Congolese kingdom, there is greater cooperation between and coordination between in the slave trade between Portuguese, Brazilians, and Africans in order to make the slave industry operate more seamlessly. In South Africa, we're turning attention basically towards southern Africa, the southern portion of the continent. By about the late 17th century, the Portuguese begin to lose control of settlements and possessions. This is the case in the area specifically of Mozambique. In 1652, the Dutch East India Company was going to establish a permanent settlement at what is known as Cape Town, and by 1707, we have the earliest recorded mention of a settler describing himself as an Afrikaner. So this is of interest because it kind of gives us insight as to the further development of identity, parallel to white settlers beginning to define themselves for themselves in a colonial kind of context. Certain parallels you can draw with what was happening with Americans roughly about the same period of time, but really as we get into the 1740s with regard to the English settlers in the eastern Atlantic seaboard, basically this region of North America, you're going to see a sense of people referring to themselves less as English and more as American. So you can see a kind of a parallel here taking place. So just to wrap up very quickly here, Africa offers really a unique tapestry as to developments that were taking place between the 16th and 18th centuries here. I know it's kind of a quick, broad strokes overview here, but it really kind of gives you a sense of just the different regions and just how vast the continent of Africa is, how varied it is, and as a result, having to pay some attention or give some sort of context to all the variety that the continent and its populations and cultures have to offer is not easy to do, especially in a world history context. But nonetheless, we get a sense here of, on the one hand, there was this shift again towards a centralized power and militarization in response to slave trade activities. And again, this in some cases meant a concerted regulation of who was eligible for export and who was not, as in the case of the Congolese kingdom. On the other hand, the various kingdoms and empires of Africa retained, in many respects, a degree, in some cases a high degree, as seen with the Ethiopian empire, a high degree of autonomy throughout this same period of time. Examples include not only Ethiopia but also the Congolese kingdom and Benin in many respects as well, and there were others. Interestingly, European enlightened principles began to combine with other events in Europe, and they began to, in which you have a growing segment of European society beginning to question the institutions of slavery, and this would lead to manumission societies, basically the freeing of slaves. It's met with some limited success. For example, in 1787, Freetown was founded in Sierra Leone, which was designed to provide basically a city for freed slaves to be repatriated from Britain and British colonies back to Africa. On May 9th of 1787, in fact, some 400 ex-slaves were resettled there, and British abolitionists hoped that this would be, or kind of have a cascading-like effect as far as the shift, the move towards ending slavery once and for all, at least within British society. I already addressed how Britain had really its economy within Britain itself had uh, kind of a limited need for um, using slaves within European Britain, but of course it did need a hefty amount of slave labor in order to meet the demands in its colonies. By 1792, Denmark also moved to prohibit the slave trade, and just 2 years later, in 1794, the French National Assembly, as one you mentioned in your post, freed all slaves without compensation. And this was amidst the French Revolution. The French Revolution acting as kind of this source for unfettered liberty, fraternity, and equality across all aspects of the social spectrum. So regardless of race, gender, class, just to name the big three, it was France's effort to really kind of get at, kind of re establishing, rebooting the social order, and acting as an inspiration for others to do so as well. We'll get into the details of the French Revolution, um, how exactly it went about trying to exact those kinds of very uh, disorienting is the word that comes to mind, but I'm trying to think of a better word. Um, the utter reversal, you might say, of long held established concepts in social order and political order and so on and so forth, um, and how others began to use this either to crack down and enforce their own status quo, or in the case of revolutionaries, even up through into the 20th centuries, would use it as a source of inspiration to carry out their own kind of revolutionary ideas. Yet, European powers would come to reassert themselves in the interim between all that. European powers would come to reassert themselves within the continent of Africa itself by the late 19th century. Um, this would be, as I mentioned at the outset, a more formalized uh, system of control, and it would be more direct and colonial in its orientation of dictating power. So that gets us roughly again up to about the turn of the 18th into the 19th century, as far as giving us an idea of what's happening in Africa. Again, I'll have that scan of that article, brief article, for you to look at and post as well. It should be in the same folder as this lecture, so for convenience. But we'll look at, like I said, industrialization, the French and American revolutions, get us through that latter part of the 18th century and into the 19th century before we um, begin to round out the material that's going to be included in Module 2 here, and eligible, therefore, for the second exam coming up in a couple weeks. All right, I'll see you in the next lecture.